Hello. This is going to be the first of your video lectures for social inequality. I'm going to basically walk you through the PowerPoint presentations that I've posted on Canvas. They'll be really important for your biweekly quizzes and assignments. So I'm going to go to the screen share mode and pull up the PowerPoints, and we'll get started. Um, So I have want to make sure to take every opportunity I can to emphasize the importance of getting the books for this class. That you just can't pass the class without them. They'll be important for both your writing assignments and your quizzes. So these is what the two books look like. The first is called The Social Construction of Difference and Inequality. It's very important that you get the eighth edition of this book. The previous editions do not have the same readings, and so you will, not get credit for your assignments, and you'll have trouble with the quizzes because you won't have the right readings. So make sure that you get the eighth edition of this book. The second one is called The Age of Inequality. There is only one edition of this book, so you don't need to worry about that. The first book, loosely, they're both like collections of short articles. The first book is The Social Construction of Difference and Inequality, has more articles that are from like social scientific journals. They're a little bit longer. They're a little bit more academic in their tone. The Age of Inequality has more journalistic articles. They're shorter and they cover like basically a 40-year history, as it says, by a magazine called In These Times, that sort of tracks these issues of inequality and, as it says, corporate America's war on working people. So the two texts are intended to kind of complement one another, to be, two sides of a coin. These are basically the five questions that we've organized the course around, and that will continue to come back to week after week, and with the various lectures and readings. So we'll start today with number one. What is social inequality? How do we measure it statistically in terms of wealth, income, and poverty? So this first lecture will have a lot of charts and graphs and maps and numbers. This is one of the objectives, of course, in this course is to give you a kind of a statistical literacy about how to read, some of these, quantitative data that will and qualitative data. That's a very important part of being a sociology major and a social scientist. Um, how have sociological theorists sought to understand social inequality using concepts like class, status, and cultural capital? How do these sorts of inequality intersect with those of race and gender in a matrix of domination? So these are kind of the theoretical questions that will really start to hop into around week three. We'll kind of lightly tread on some of them today, but they'll continue to come back periodically, particularly this question of how class inequalities intersect with those of race and gender and other forms of inequality, other identities. This is sometimes called like an intersectional approach. And we'll be employing that at many times throughout the semester as we look at different topics. The third set of questions has to do with how have the dynamics of social inequality changed over time. So this is a kind of a historical question. What economic and political factors have caused social inequality to worsen since the 1970s? We'll start looking at this today. You'll be, confronted with it in your first film that you have to watch, the film called um, the Age of Inequality, featuring Robert Reich. And the 1970s, as we will emphasize, is a really pivotal kind of turning point in American history where we start to see these trends towards increasing inequality, an increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor, if you will, and a kind of shrinking of what was called the middle class. So those questions, again, will periodically come up throughout the semester, but we'll be getting started with looking at them today, particularly through Robert Reich's film. The fourth question, set of questions, has to do with how are inequalities reproduced from generation to generation. This is a question of what we call social reproduction. That is to say, how are inequalities reproduced in A, social institutions like schools, the family, work, the state, etc., and B, systems of representation like the media, language, and culture. So, in both these, looking at these social institutions and systems of representation, our question will be how they contribute to the reproduction of inequality from generation to generation over time. How is it that these systems of inequality are kept in place and justified by these various institutions and systems of representation? Those are the questions that we get into more around the middle of the semester, especially. We take different weeks looking at schools and the media and culture and the workplace as sites of social reproduction. And then finally, we look at the questions of how have social movements resisted inequality and sought social change? What can be done to transform the social institutions and systems of representation that perpetuate inequality? This is kind of the way that we try to end the semester. We'll be looking at social movements, periodically throughout the semester, but at the end of the semester, there's a greater emphasis on them. Movements like Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street, or more historically the labor movement in the United States. We look at these social movements to kind of try to end the semester with a sense of like hopefulness, with a sense that like what people are doing to contest these forms of inequality that we see in society. So a lot of the bulk of the semester is going to be looking at, quite frankly, some pretty depressing facts about American society, how it's becoming more unequal, and how these systems, these institutions are reproducing that inequality. So then we try to end on a more like kind of hopeful note with looking at the long history of how ordinary people have organized and mobilized and taken to the streets in an attempt that sometimes has been successful attempts to change these dynamics of inequality. So these are the sort of five questions that kind of organize the our course and the kind of the flow of the semester. In this first lecture, as I mentioned, is mostly we're going to be looking at kind of quantitative facts. We're going to be taking a statistical overview of wealth, poverty, and inequality in the United States. Um, so, in addition to understanding inequality, one key course outcome of this class is statistical literacy. So, how to decipher quantitative data, numbers, graphs, charts, maps, and so forth. Then, having introduced the landscape of inequality, the remaining lectures will seek to explain why these social processes are occurring. And, we'll kind of start from sociological theories and different scientific studies in order to try to kind of piece together this puzzle, to come up with an explanation or a series of explanations about why this is happening. So we'll start with kind of like the facts of like, this is like how things are in America today. And then over the course of the semester, like sociological detectives, we're going to try to kind of piece together the puzzle of like, how did this happen and why is it still happening? So, the themes of this first lecture, we're going to start with looking at the distribution of income and wealth. Also, like how do we measure these things called income and wealth in the first place? Then we'll be looking at the landscape of poverty and social inequality and homelessness and things of this matter. Then we'll look at how these sort of long-term trends have been were accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of these trends that were already kind of in place have all kind of gotten worse as a result of what we've been through in the last 5 years. With this COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath, and that'll sort of prep us for thinking about the relationship between like crisis and economic inequality that we'll be taking up when you look at the film called The Shock Doctrine and other materials around like week 3 and 4. And then finally, at the end of the lecture here, I'm going to kind of prime you for your first film called Inequality for All with Robert Reich, and try to, just kind of point you to what you should be getting out of the film, particularly as Reich identifies the 1970s as this key turning point in that is kind of the beginning of the kind of trends that we're seeing now and have been seeing in the last 50 years with widening inequality and the shrinking of the middle class. So we start here with income and wealth, and so it's important to sort of like lay out our definitions of what we mean by these two things. They're sometimes used interchangeably, income and wealth, but they're not the same, at least in terms of how we measure them statistically and how we as sociologists approach that kind of data. So for household income, the U.S. Census, that's done every 10 years, reports basically two median household income estimates based on data from two different surveys, the current population survey and the American Community Survey. What's important to know about that is just that household income can be measured in different kinds of ways. There's not like one consensus definition. The way that the US Census measures it is kind of laid out here. It's basically the income of every resident of a household that's over the age of 15. And that includes, wages and salaries, and also any kind of pre-tax personal business income, investment, or recurring source of income. And it also includes any kind of like government payments, government entitlements, such as unemployment insurance, Social Security, disability payments, child support payments. So basically, like household income is kind of like what it sounds like. It's basically the income the salary and wages that are taken in by every member of the household. As it says here, the residents of the household don't have to be related to the head of household in order to be for their earnings to be considered part of that income. So it's basically just like the money that is taken in like every month or every week or every year by the members of the household. In America, approximately the sort of the median household income is about $80,000 a year. When we use that term median, we mean kind of like right in the middle of the population. So 50% of people would be above 80,000 a year, and 50% of people would be below 80,000 a year. Again, it kind of depends on how you measure it, but it's roughly around $80,000 a year is like what the median household brings in. Now, we're going to be looking at the questions then of how this is distributed, how household income is distributed. Distribution is kind of our measure of inequality in society. And so we see here that the basically the statistics here divided households into what we call quintiles. So divided by increments of 20%. So there's the top 20%, and then the second income, or the second quintile would be between 80 and 60%, and so forth. So the richest quintile, the top 20%, and they earn about half, a little over half of all the household income in the country. While the lowest quintile is the poorest 20%, they take home only about 3.5%. So if you imagine like household income in the country as just like a giant pizza, you have like 20% of the country that's taking like half the pizza, and you have another 20% that's only getting like 3.5% of the pizza. For those who are in the average income for those, top quintile is about $357,000 a year, which is roughly 16 times as much as the average income of household income in the lowest quintile. In the lowest quintile, the average is about $21,900 a year. So this is quite a discrepancy, and you'll notice in the graph that it's actually gotten worse over time. You notice like in the early 70s, the top 20% was only taking home about 42 or 43%. And then sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, it surpassed 50%, where it's pretty much been ever since. So that's at that point that the richest 20% started taking over half of our metaphorical pizza. And so basically the line separating the green line here from all the rest of the lines has widened over time. Again, this is going to be a thing that we emphasize throughout the semester, this growing inequality since the 1970s. So the gap separating the richest 20% from the rest of the population here, that's visually articulated for you. Here's what we get if we kind of look here by geographically across the country. So on the left-hand side, we have median household income as it's shown like county by county. And here, the areas that have the green and the darkest green are the counties that have like the highest median income. So you see like San Francisco is among the places that has the highest median income in the country. And then counties in red, and especially in dark red, are those that have the lowest incomes per county. And you see that a lot of that, is concentrated in the South, in the deep South. A lot of it you see there kind of in the Southwest around New Mexico. You see a lot of red around sort of the Appalachian area of West Virginia and Kentucky. And then the green areas, the more affluent areas, are kind of, pocketed around the country, but the main, um, uh, sort of the main concentrations are on the West Coast and the Northeast coast. The second map does this by state. So here, like the blue, the states with the blue, especially the dark blue, are the highest income states, and the states that are reddest are, especially dark red, are those with the lowest incomes. So again, California, on the East Coast, you see Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland. These are the states with the darkest blue, and then a number of those states also with more kind of like shades of light blue. Um, and then in the in the South and the Southwest, again, we see like Arkansas and Mississippi, and then up there we got West Virginia. These are the places that have sort of like the lowest median incomes in the country. It's kind of interesting to think about how if you're a person that pays attention to like politics and elections, to think about how these maps of income are similar to the kind of like political maps in terms of like red states and blue states, whether they vote Republican or Democratic. Um, this is something that I don't really have time to get into now, but it's something that we can, revisit as the semester kind of goes on. Um, Now we come to wealth, which is different from income. Um, Wealth refers to basically the sum total of a person's assets. So your car, but also like your stocks and bonds, your value of your home, your artwork. For most Americans, their home is their most valuable source of wealth, and their retirement accounts are their second most valuable. But for the wealthy, it's a different story. For the wealthy, it's more what's classified as like business equity and net financial assets, which are things like stocks and bonds. Those are the greatest source of wealth. So what this chart here is basically revealing is, again, like breaking down the population into quintiles. You see that like the poorest 20% here on the left side have don't own like anything. Um, Maybe the most valuable thing that they own is like their car or a small retirement account. Um, what's called net other financial, non-financial wealth. And then as you move up, um, from there, you see that the green bar is where most of their wealth comes from, and that's home equity, the value of their home. So, like I said, that's for most people, that is what is their main source of wealth. And then the blue part is their retirement accounts, right? So for between the 20% and say like 75, 80, 90%, I guess this isn't in quintiles, but in quadruples, in groups of four. But as you sort of go from the sort of the middle into the middle classes here, those who are in the closer to the median household wealth. For most people, it's their home and their retirement accounts that are um, their main sources of wealth. And as you go towards the wealthier sections, though, like towards like the 1% and the top 10%, you see of this kind of red bar, which is in business equity and other, what does it say, net other financial wealth. So that's a lot of like kind of stocks and bonds, investment, real estate, these sorts of things are the main sources of wealth for the top 1% and the top 10%. And they don't even show up on the left hand of this graph. Um, they don't really even show up for the bottom 50% of the country. So this is another way of saying that the gains over the last 40 years in terms of wealth have primarily come from like the stock market, from the value of shares of the stock market, and who benefits from that? Well, it's not the poorest half of the country. It's generally like the richest of the rich. The richest 1% own about half of the stock market, and that's where much of the sort of the wealth that has accumulated over the last 40 or 50 years, where that has really taken off. So when we look at the distribution of wealth, it's much more unequal than the distribution of income. We saw in the previous graph that income is very unequally distributed in this society, but wealth much more so. The wealthiest 10%, as this graph shows you here, own about 74% of the total wealth. So about three quarters, you know. So again, if you imagine our proverbial pizza, we have basically like 10% of the population that's taking, three quarters of that. And then the next 40% own most of the other quarter. So basically, like the top 50% of the country owns like almost all the wealth, while the bottom 50% own little or nothing. That is, as it says here, 65.5 million families. And then, compared with about 65 million families who are the ones that are the sole like wealth owners in the country. To give you a sense of like to be in the top 10%, a family would be worth at least $1.92 million. So like literal millionaires. And then to be in the next 50%, the next 40%, the part that's in green in the pie chart, a family would need to be have at least $192,000 in wealth. So that's would be generally like people that own a home. To be in the bottom 50% meant a family had less than $192,000 in wealth. And of this group, some 9.9 million families had negative net worth, meaning that their debts were greater than their assets. So that they owe more money, in car payments or credit card debt or medical debt than they have in terms of their assets of wealth. Now, this is looking at, of course, the concentration of wealth. We have this super wealthy class, the so-called 1%, as people in Occupy Wall Street called them, who have seen their wealth expand enormously in the past several decades. There kind of has always been like a 1% in this country. There's always been a sort of kind of a wealthy elite. But the difference is that it's gotten exponentially wealthier in the past few decades and is now wealthier than any ruling class in the history of the world has ever been. So the distribution is increasingly concentrated at the very top among this so-called 1%. The richest 1% of the population owns about 35% of the country's total wealth. Again, it kind of depends on how you measure it, but all the measurements suggest, somewhere between 30 and 40% that is owned just by this 1%. And that is they're gobbling up more than they used to. The 1% in the 1970s owned about 20% of the nation's total wealth. So to give you a sense, the average personal wealth of people in this top or 1% is more than 1,000 times that of people in the bottom 50%. And in the period of the last 5 years, kind of since COVID, we'll see that this has become even more concentrated. So that today, the richest 5 men in the world have more than doubled their wealth since 2020, from 405 billion to 869 billion. That's just five people. I think it's Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison from Oracle, and I can't remember who the fifth is. It might be Bill Gates. But just those 5 men have doubled their wealth in the last 5 years and are now, in somewhere in the 200 billion or more in terms of their total wealth. Now, one of the reasons that this has also happened, or certainly hasn't made it worse, has been tax policy, and this has come up again here in 2025 with Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill that instituted another round of tax cuts for the wealthy and especially the super wealthy. Overall, tax rates on the wealthy have declined pretty significantly, particularly since the high watermark in World War II. As you see in this graph on the right, in 1945, when World War II ended, the marginal income tax rate on the highest earners was as high as 94%. So basically, the United States was leaning on the super wealthy to basically help pay for the war effort, to pay a larger share of the sort of war effort, and it stayed pretty high, that tax rate, throughout the 1950s and 60s and even into the 1970s, and that financed a lot of public projects and social works, like building public schools and public universities, funding infrastructure, funding, sort of social programs. The tax rates on the wealthy remained pretty high for decades after World War II. And then Ronald Reagan, when he came into office, this was, sort of one of his big promises to the wealthy constituency of the Republican Party, was that he was going to cut their marginal tax rates, and he did precipitously in 1981 when he came into office. And so you see a significant decline there in the tax rates, and they've kind of gone, a little bit up sometimes, a little bit down at others. It kind of correlates with which party is in office. So when George W. Bush was in office, he instituted another round of tax cuts for the wealthy. Um, Donald Trump's first term in 2017, 2018, he instituted another round of cuts for the wealthy. And then, as we saw with the Big Beautiful Act, did that again most recently here in 2025. So this has gotten to a point where, at the very moment that billionaires are making more money than ever before, and are worth, exponentially more than rich people were in previous generations, they're also having their taxes cut. And so it's gotten to the point whereas this chart from Forbes on the left side shows you, in 2018, billionaires paid a lower tax rate than the poorest half of the U.S. population. Remember that the poorest half of the U.S. population that effectively owns nothing in this country, and billionaires are effectively paying a lower tax rate, as it shows that trend through the years, starting back in the 1960s, when the wealthiest families, the 400 wealthiest families, paid a significantly higher um, percentage of their wealth. And again, this has been or will be exacerbated now that this big beautiful bill has passed. You notice on the left side that basically, like, the richer you are, the bigger your tax break. That's happened. So people making over $1 million a year are reaping the biggest benefits, on average about $90,000 in their tax cut. The top 1% at 4.3%. So you notice this kind of trend in this bar graph on the left side, that, the richer you are, the bigger the tax cut. And then for most people, it amounts to very little or nothing. For the bottom 20%, they're gaining $90 in tax cuts. The second 20%, about $640. And then on the graph on the right hand side, there's the reason that people refer to the Big Beautiful Bill as the single largest transfer of wealth in American history, a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, effectively, is because of this sort of graph that we see here on the right, that or this sort of chart, which is that the tax cuts of $1.1 trillion that primarily assist the rich have been paid for are going to be paid for by cuts to Medicaid and healthcare, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, and SNAP, which is nutritional assistance to people living in poverty, or just to families. So the cuts to these programs are kind of being used to fund these tax cuts, and so that's why people refer to this as the single largest transfer of wealth in American history from the poor to the rich. Now, the wealth gap, the distribution of wealth and wealth inequality also intersects with race and gender. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, we're taking this kind of intersectional approach to how class inequalities relate to other forms of inequalities in society. We'll get more into this in future lectures, but the main reason for this so-called racial wealth gap that divides white households from people of color has to do with housing and housing discrimination over many decades. The sort of policies around housing that were instituted in the federal government, especially after World War II, when like the suburbs were being developed and the suburbs were growing, and a lot of white families were moving out to the suburbs to buy new houses. There were these kind of discriminatory policies in place that kind of locked out people of color. And so, as a result, generations later, even decades later, it has this kind of cumulative effect in terms of what we call the racial wealth gap. And you'll see one of the things you can see quite plainly is that the racial wealth gap has actually grown over time. We have made no progress as a society into making this more equitable. White families own about 85% of total household wealth, whereas Hispanic families own only 4% and Black families only 2%. And so you see here, this kind of tracks this over time. Again, we will be coming back to the reasons for this in more detail down the line. But right now, we just want to kind of take statistical note of this gap and to sort of make matters more complicated, how this also intersects with gender. So for so-called female-headed households, which is what the census calls them, among Black and Hispanic women, they own just 5 and 10 cents on the dollar for every dollar of median wealth held by families headed by white men. Now, it's important to think about why this really matters in people's day-to-day lives. This kind of large gender and race-based wealth gap indicates that a lot of these families, especially if they're so-called female-headed households, have much smaller financial cushions, like say in a case of an emergency or a job loss or a sickness or something like that. Wealth is the thing that people can kind of tap into in those sorts of moments. So if you own a house, right, you can refinance, take out a second mortgage, something where you can kind of like borrow against the value of what you own. But if you don't own anything, right, it makes those emergencies much more dire. So, savings or, other kind of assets, things can blunt the impact of personal economic crises when people are losing their income or being laid off, which is precisely what happened, especially to low-wage workers during COVID. It occurred disproportionately for women working, like, say, in the service industry during the COVID-19 recession. People not only lost their jobs, but they didn't have like a kind of a safety net to fall back on. And so at the same time that these billionaires were getting richer, more and more families were being kind of thrown into precarity. So with that in mind, we go from the question of wealth to the question of poverty. Here we want to start with how the government defines these sorts of things. The US government defines poverty basically in terms of a food budget for a family. Pardon me. That definition that's based on food budget was instituted in the 1960s, and this has been basically the way that the US government measures poverty ever since. Like how it draws what's called the poverty line, which is the amount of income that defines whether one is in poverty or not. The amount of like the low threshold of income that defines poverty. And so, because the poverty line is based on a food budget, a lot of people argue that this underrepresents the extent of poverty in the United States. Because the thing is that the costs of other necessities like housing, healthcare, and childcare have all increased at a much faster rate than the price of food since the 1960s. I mean, I think we all kind of intuitively know this, like housing, healthcare, and childcare are just way more expensive than they were relative to inflation during the 1960s. The cost of these things has gone exponentially up, whereas food prices have kind of gone more incrementally up. And so, if anything, these calculations of poverty probably underestimate just how many people are living in conditions of true precarity, of food insecurity, housing insecurity, with inadequate health care, and so forth. But by the official measure, even by the official measure, we have about 38 million Americans who are living in poverty. That's about 11.5% of the population. And it's sort of mapped here again. Again, we see the same kinds of trends. Those that have the darkest red areas are those that have the greatest populations or greatest percentage of the populations that are living in poverty. We see a lot of this in the South, again in the Southwest. Even in California, we look towards like the Central Valley there, and we see some pretty deep pockets of red. There's almost nowhere that we don't see at least some pockets of poverty geographically across the country. Now, to look at this kind of thing over time is very interesting because you'll see in these graphs that starting in the 1960s, the United States, American society actually dramatically reduced our poverty rates. We had a series of programs and policies that were then known as the War on Poverty, and they were by no means perfect. They certainly had their flaws, but they, as the statistics show here, were indisputably effective in reducing the amount of poverty in this country. You see here where the charts begin in 1959. We had something more like 25% or 24% of the population that was living in poverty, something more like 40 million people. And both of those numbers precipitously declined throughout the 1960s until about 1970. So the poverty rate fell by half, roughly, between 1960 and 1970, from 23% to 11.5%. So we made a lot of progress. Since the 1970s, their progress has really stalled. Since the 1970s, the poverty rate has remained roughly between 11 and 15%, kind of, fluctuates in there depending on economic recessions and, booms and bust cycles of the economy. But, it's roughly been in there because, we largely abandoned a lot of those war on poverty measures, particularly starting in the 1980s. There's been sort of steady cuts to welfare programs and food stamps and these forms of like assistance have been kind of like rolled back And as a result, we've really stopped making a lot of progress as a society in terms of reducing poverty. But the good news is that this example from the 1960s, these historical events reveal that there is something that can be done about poverty, that this is not inevitable, that we just, as they say, the poor will always be with us and all this kind of thing. The history of this country shows that that's just not true. That when we made a priority and took policies and measures to make it happen, we were effective not in totally eliminating poverty, but in significantly reducing its prevalence within the society. So the good news to be taken from this is that there are things that can be done, and we can learn from the past. And again, these programs in the war on poverty were not perfect. They were flawed in many ways. They were biased in certain kinds of directions, but the numbers here don't lie. They were effective. And we see the same kind of thing if we break down the poverty rates by age group. Now, this is really interesting because what this graph here shows is that the United States has been much better at reducing elder poverty, the poverty of it's like senior citizens, people over 65, um, and much less effective at reducing child poverty. So if you start at the left-hand graph here and look at this orange line of people 65 and older, you'll see that in 1959, about 35% of our senior citizens were living in poverty. Like this country had a real problem with elder poverty. And you see that if you follow that orange or red line, it significantly declines to the point where by 2015, elder people had the lowest rate of poverty among all the age groups. And this is the direct result of things like Social Security and Medicare. That we have these social programs that are intended to keep uh, retirees from falling into poverty. As a society, we made this a priority. Senior citizens have become, a very powerful voting bloc, so they make sure that their, interests are represented. Um, Even the most right-wing politician in this country dare not cut Social Security without sustaining a huge backlash, particularly from seniors. Likewise, it's difficult to cut things like Medicare and other programs that favor older people because they've become an important political bloc for both parties. Now you compare that to child poverty, which is like in the blue line. Um, and we've made as a society almost no progress whatsoever in eliminating child poverty. It was in the 1950s and 60s, it was around, 25%. And then it sort of went down as a result of the war on poverty in the 1960s. And so in 1970, the child poverty rate was around 15%. And then it's basically just like kind of, gone up, gone down, but not really made any progress. And so by 2015, children were the most likely to be living in poverty in this society, close to 20%, like close to like one out of every five kids in the country is born into poverty. And so you can sort of compare that with what we've done in terms of seniors with Social Security and Medicare. There just hasn't been the same kind of commitment to ending child poverty. There is an exception more recently that I will show you in the next slide, but for the most part, like, kids don't children don't amount to a kind of political constituency in the same way that seniors and retirees do. And so there has been no real kind of mass commitment as a society towards ending child poverty. But there is one exception, as we see in this graph here. During COVID, there was a reduction in child poverty because the United States Congress expanded this thing called the child tax credit, which basically just kind of gives monthly payments to parents with children. And it's directly intended as a measure of trying to reduce child poverty. So for a brief period here in 2020, 2021, we expanded the child tax credit. And what happened was as you see in the graph here on the left side, a dramatic reduction in the child poverty rate, like almost overnight. Like this thing goes from, having, as we saw in the previous slide, like for decades, this number was kind of stalled. And there's a precipitous drop off to the point where child poverty hit a low in 2021. And then it goes right back up in 2022. What happened in 2022? Well, basically, the Congress allowed this expanded child tax credit to expire. It was a very contentious vote. All the Republicans in the Senate were for letting it expire. Most of the Democrats were for expanding the child tax credit, with the exception of this guy, Joe Manchin. He was at the time, he was a Democrat. He's no longer, he's left the party and become an independent. He represents the state of West Virginia. He was kind of the deciding vote in this, this very evenly divided Congress. And he basically argued that if you gave money to poor people, if you kept giving money to poor people, that they would just spend it on drugs. This is, sort of an enduring critique based on stereotypes and all sorts of biases that has long gotten in the way of this country making any kind of headway around poverty. It's just they trot out these tired old stereotypical ideas that if you give money to poor people, they're just going to use it on drugs or liquor or cigarettes or some kind of immoral, unhealthy behavior. So as a result, the child poverty rate spiked back up starting in 2022, and we kind of like reversed all the progress that we had made. But again, there's a silver lining of good news in this cloud of events, and that is that something like child poverty, again, is not inevitable. It can't. There's something that can be done. There are policy initiatives. There are things that can be done to reduce child poverty. That this is not something that we simply have to accept as a society. It is a policy decision, right? Now, again, to sort of take our intersectional approach and look at how poverty rates intersect with gender and race, we see the highest rates of poverty among American Indian or Alaska Native women, so groups that are often lumped together as indigenous populations, and also among Black women and Latinas. So in all of these racial and ethnic groups, women have higher rates of poverty than men. So when we're talking about this intersectional approach, that's how that kind of plays out here. Um, in indigenous groups, generally speaking, in this country, have the highest poverty rates. Here, we're talking about approximately 1 in 4 of indigenous women, and that is the highest poverty rate of any among women or men of any racial or ethnic group. And so, in every category, except for Asian or Pacific Islanders, we see that women are more likely to be in poverty. And this will be especially important when we start to look at the changing demographics of families in this country, because one of the things that has happened over the decades has been an increase in female-headed households for a number of reasons. But the fact is that there are more households that where the woman is the prime breadwinner, or maybe the only breadwinner. And so the fact that the poverty rates are higher among all of these groups means that their families are more likely to be struggling. Um, in terms of how these, to continue our sort of intersectional approach, how these poverty rates intersect with race, gender identity, and sexual orientation, we see that rates of poverty for LGBTQ people of color are close to or higher than those for cis straight people of their own racial and ethnic group, and are notably higher than for white people, whether straight or LGBTQ. So again, we can imagine just sort of like the continuing effects of discrimination and all sorts of like explicit and implicit bias that are more likely to have people who are non straight cis people living in conditions of poverty. So LGBTQ women experience higher rates of poverty than cisgender straight women and men due to these intersections of discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity or expression. This survey by the UCLA Law School showed that about 17.9% of lesbian cisgender women, 29.4% of bisexual cisgender women, and 29.4% of transgender people live in poverty. All of those numbers are disproportionate to the population as a whole, which is again about 11.5%. So in some cases, people are twice as likely, or even close to 3 times more likely, to be living in poverty. How this intersects with disability is also a statistical fact. Women with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty than both men with disabilities and individuals without disabilities. So the poverty rate among women with disabilities is about twice as high as it is for the rest of the population. It's 22.9%, compared with 17.9% for men with disabilities and 11.4% for women without disabilities. So when we talk about poverty in this society, it intersects with all of these different variables, or what we'll call like the matrix of domination in society at large. And so we need to kind of take this intersectional approach to truly understand what's going on. At the most extreme forms of poverty, we have homelessness, which is becoming a more prevalent and very visible issue in the society. It continues to increase such that in 2023, we saw over 650,000 people experiencing homelessness, and that represented a record high tally and a 12% increase over the previous year. That includes over 111,620 children. Homelessness is becoming more of a national issue in the sense that 41 out of the 50 states saw an increase in homelessness in that 1 year period. It is predominantly an urban issue in the sense that more than a half of homeless individuals reside in the nation's largest 50 cities, with New York and Los Angeles containing about 1/4 of the country's unhoused people. But in going across the country, this is something that you can now see pretty much everywhere. And it's directly related to the cost of housing and what's known as like the housing crisis, which is something that might be more extreme in a place like the Bay Area, but increasingly the rest of the country is becoming more like the Bay Area in terms of increasing rents and costs of housing and the consequences for greater unhoused populations. This is true, something that's true of all ethnic groups, as it says. Every ethnic group endured an increase in homelessness last year. So this is something that we'll be kind of tackling a bit later in the semester. I'll have a particular focus on explaining what's going on in the Bay Area with homelessness, with the idea that like the rest of the country is kind of becoming more like the Bay Area in terms of seeing these kinds of problems. Speaking of which, in San Francisco, on any given night, you have about approximately 8,000 unhoused people, maybe as high as 10,000. It kind of depends on the time of year and other sort of variables. But you can, it's roughly around 8,000, maybe a little bit more people in San Francisco alone, and closer to 38 to 40,000 in the Bay Area at large. And now the thing is that number is dwarfed by the number of vacant homes. So in San Francisco, you have like 8,000 people, sleeping on the streets or sleeping in their cars or whatever. But you have like 40,000 vacant units. Again, this is kind of an estimate. I've seen as high as like people thinking maybe 60,000, but you have all of these kind of vacant units throughout the city. And this is kind of our first clue towards explaining the homelessness issue in San Francisco and across the country. This is also true. It's the problem isn't necessarily that there isn't enough housing, because you're talking about like for every unhoused person, there's like 5 vacant units in the city. Um, it is therefore kind of a question of distribution, right? And not of necessarily supply, but of the distribution of housing. So we'll get into that in a more detailed way later in the semester. I'll have a lecture that focuses on specifically on the housing crisis in the Bay Area. But just kind of keep that in your hat for now. The idea that for every unhoused person, we have many more units that are just like sitting vacant. And so that should kind of lead us to the questions, not of just of simply of supply. Like it's not just like, oh, we need to build more housing. It's more like we need like a fairer distribution of the housing that is available, and maybe not to just simply build more housing, but to build like affordable housing. So California is the leading state for homelessness in the U.S. Again, it's a symptom of this housing crisis, this lack of affordable housing, this crisis. Now you can see, in Portland and Seattle, and again, like the rest of the country is becoming more like California in this regard, as the cost of housing continues to increase. People's rents become more unaffordable. It becomes harder for people, to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment, or even a studio or something like that. Um, and people that do are often paying, a great amount of their income, like half of their income, going to rent. Um, this is a problem. The housing crisis is not just a problem for the people that don't have a home, but it's increasingly a problem for millions and millions of working Americans who are not able to afford housing, or just barely able to afford housing. So now we sort of turn to how all these trends that we've seen kind of building up over decades, up until 2020, say like for 50 years approximately, between 1970 and 2020, it's like COVID, like stepped on the gas pedal and accelerated these dynamics. It didn't create them, but it certainly like accelerated them. So when we look at the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of this landscape of inequality that we've been talking about, the conclusions that we reach are that billionaire wealth has skyrocketed, as we saw with like the five richest people in the world doubling their wealth. This has been mainly by sort of squeezing workers and consumers. Higher income individuals have been more likely to work from home. And so higher income people have been more like insulated from the worst effects of the crisis of COVID, because they're able to stay at home and work remotely, and work on their laptop or what have you. Whereas low wage workers had much higher pandemic job losses. You can think about people, say, working in the service industry, which was hit especially hard in the first year, certainly in the first few months of the pandemic. Non-union workers were more likely to lose their jobs compared to workers represented by a union. COVID-19 and hospitalization rates were higher among people of color, and Black and Latinx people were less likely to telework, and they faced higher unemployment rates. So the disease kind of itself doesn't really discriminate. I mean, it hits everybody. We're all kind of human, but the social effects of this crisis were very unevenly experienced, right? So that those who were already more vulnerable within our society were those who had the worst effects, who felt the worst effects of this crisis, and those who had the wealth and were, sort of predisposed to take advantage of these crises, say like Amazon and Jeff Bezos. Their wealth skyrocketed as a result. So it was really, we're talking here about the social consequences of a health crisis. And again, this will be very important as we look towards weeks 3 and 4 of the course, where we look at Naomi Klein's film called The Shock Doctrine. Naomi Klein actually wrote a book, and then the film is kind of based on her book. And it's this idea of what Klein calls disaster capitalism, the way in which like a crisis or a disaster is taken advantage of by elites and by sort of corporations and banks and the richest of the rich, and the way in which, like all over the world, in various kinds of circumstances, they have used a crisis or a disaster to their advantage, both in terms of their profits and in terms of like their power, their power over governments and the state and these sorts of things. So this you might want the shock doctrine was written and the film was made before COVID-19. But as you're watching and thinking about this idea, you might want to keep, sort of the pandemic in the back of your mind as like as a more current instance in which these same dynamics of disaster capitalism were played out. Here you see a more sort of detailed chart about a thing I mentioned in a previous slide about how much these billionaires were able to increase their wealth over the first just 19 months, so the first year and a half of the pandemic, between March 2020 and October 2021. The richest 15 billionaires increased their wealth by a total of 732 billion. So on average, almost double, an average increase of 86.6%. Someone like Elon Musk, Elon Musk himself, especially made out like a bandit during this period of time, increased his wealth, as it says here, from his pre-pandemic wealth was a mere 25 billion. And then by October of 2021, he had increased that to 200 billion. So a 751% increase in wealth. On the other side of the coin, the low-wage job losses. This again breaks American society into 5 quintiles, from the highest income to the lowest income. And you see that with pretty predictable results here, that those who are at the lowest income quintile were more likely to have lost their job. So especially in the first month or two of the pandemic, there's a sort of a slow recovery, but you notice the way that this dark blue line at the bottom drops off precipitously in the early days of the pandemic, around March 24th, 2020, around that period. And that they are also kind of like the slowest to recover. And so the COVID was truly exemplifies this saying about, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It just kind of intensified and accelerated these trends that had been taking place over decades. Okay, so speaking of the trends that have been taking place over the course of decades, your first film, Inequality for All, is going to give you, again, a kind of a long view of these processes. It's an award-winning documentary by this guy named Robert Reich, who was a Secretary of Labor going back to the Clinton administration. He basically worked for Bill Clinton in the 90s, and then sort of resigned at the end of his first term because Clinton wasn't really doing the things that Robert Reich thought he should be doing. Um, wasn't really taking his advice. So what Reich does in this film is he basically shows how these trends of inequality have really accelerated since the 1970s. The 1970s is again this kind of pivotal moment, and you see this in this graph. He'll refer to this in the film itself, where you have these kind of these two peaks and this valley in the middle, right? And the peaks are where the 1% was taking home the largest share of income. So in these peak moments here of 1928 and 2007, are moments of like peak inequality. And the two things that those dates have in common is that they were immediately followed by great economic crises. Of course, 1929 is the beginning of the Great Depression, when you have the stock market crash, and then the 1930s that followed was, the Great Depression. So then in 2007, that is immediately followed by the economic crisis of 2008, the meltdown in especially like the housing market and the connections that tie together housing and finance capital. And so you have then like what's, we call the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, so he's sort of identifying that like these points of extreme inequality are like not good for the economy. They create these kind of bubbles that eventually burst, and the problem is that it's not the wealthy who pay for it. The people that suffer the consequences of these crises, whether we're talking about the 1930s or whether we're talking about today, the people that suffer are the ones who are already the most vulnerable to begin with, the working classes. And so he's sort of trying to show you the historical parallels between these periods. And then in the middle, we have this kind of like this valley where the amount of income inequality was actually much lower in the 1960s and 70s. So he's using this number of the top 1% share as like a metric, as an index of the amount of inequality in society. So it reaches this really high point in the late 1920s, and then it reaches this really high point again in the 2000s. But in the middle, it's at a very low point in the 1960s and 70s, and like going even towards the 40s and 50s. And so he's going to kind of like contrast these two these eras, the era of extreme inequality in our time with this moment, after World War II and in the decades that followed World War II, where we had like less inequality. It's not that we had no inequality, but like there was a more even distribution of income and wealth, and there was like a growth of the middle class and this sort of thing. It was a more equitable society, which it has ceased to be since particularly like the 1980s. So the 1970s is the period where Reich, kind of says this is the pivotal moment. He says like something happened in the 1970s, and his film is like he's like trying to figure out what it is that changed. He is Robert Reich has been a professor at UC Berkeley. He's taught for years this class that's pretty similar to the one that you're in now. I think it's called like income or like wealth and poverty in America, or something along these lines. He's just retiring now, So in the film, it's kind of interspersed with him talking about these dynamics, and then you see him like teaching this huge class in Berkeley to all these undergraduates, and then kind of like interviewing people about their struggles. So it kind of puts a human face on this whole process. It's a very good film, and I think that you'll like it and get something out of it. So here we have just kind of the larger, like what to look for, and the points about the film that I want to emphasize. Again, like the inequality has been increasing since the late 70s and early 80s, but this was not always the case. As Reich will point out, in the decades after the end of World War II, there was actually growing equality. This society was becoming more equal in the sense that there was a reduction of poverty, as we've emphasized. There was the growth of the so-called middle class, um, and the richest 1% was taking a smaller slice of the pie. They owned a declining share of income and wealth. So those that was a period of around, I don't know, about 30 years between, say, 1945 and 1975, that we can observe those trends. Again, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't ideal. There were, all sorts of problems and biases and, forms of discrimination, particularly around race and gender. I don't want to idealize this period of time, but it does show that like increasing inequality is not inevitable, that this country used to do things differently. And therefore, it's still possible to do things, alternatively to the way that they've been going since the 1970s and 80s. So Reich labels this period between 1947, roughly between 1947 and 1977. He calls it the Great Prosperity. And so its social policies were characterized by higher taxes on the wealthy, public investments in higher education, housing, and highway construction, the war on poverty, and finally, by stronger unions and greater union representation in politics. So working class people had a greater voice in politics, certainly compared to what they have now, which is very little. So these were kind of like the things that characterized the so-called Great Prosperity, this roughly 30-year period between the 40s and the 70s, and it had everything to do with these kind of social policies that allowed the middle class to expand and that reduced the amount of poverty in society, as we've seen. So again, this is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. While there was greater equality between the social classes during the Great Prosperity, the inequalities of race and gender certainly continued to persist. We see that sort of exploding in the 1960s and 70s with the social movements of the time, with the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the Black Panthers and Black Power and these kind of social movements in the 1960s and 70s call attention to the fact that women and people of color were basically had been kind of left behind or left out of the Great Prosperity. So again, my point is not to idealize the Great Prosperity, but to show, on the other hand, that it is possible that we can do something about inequality, that it's been done before and it can be done again, and it can be done better. It can be done more inclusively. So this is the difference between the Great Prosperity and our own times is I think, nicely visualized in this next map, this chart that shows that during the Great Prosperity, every group, every quintile, from the poorest 20% all the way to the wealthiest 1%, every group increased a significant increase in their income. So if you look at actually the lowest fifth, saw the biggest increases in their income. The lowest fifth saw an annual average income gain of almost 10%, 9.8983%, whereas the top 1% saw their income increasing by like 7%. So, they weren't exactly suffering, their incomes were going up too. But poor people experienced the largest increases in their income during this period between 1947 and 1979, right? So this is again like how people are being lifted out of poverty, during these decades. Um, then the situation is totally reversed when you go from the green bars to the red bars. When you look at the red bars between 1979 and 2004, almost the same amount of time, like a 25-year period. Um, and here you see much more what we're seeing today, that like kind of only the wealthy are really gaining in terms of their income, and everybody else is kind of stagnant, is basically at the same level. So, and ironically, the 1% income gains were a little bit smaller than they were in the period between 1947 and 1979. So there has generally been less economic growth and economic prosperity in the society as a whole, and the richest of the rich are gobbling up almost all of these new income gains, and everybody else is just kind of like treading water, like struggling not to drown. So that's how you can think about the difference between these two periods in American history. Um, this is also a way to encapsulate this, that I think speaks volumes. This graph here on the right, again, about the difference between the periods between the 40s and the 70s, and then our time, like since the 1970s. And that is if we look at the relationship between productivity and wages. So how productive people are at work, how many widgets they make at their work, or however you measure productivity, but the levels of worker productivity on the one hand, and the amount of like compensation for that productivity on the other. And you look at this graph, you see that like from the 1940s, up through about almost to 1980, the two lines parallel each other, which is to say that productivity is increasing. Workers are like twice as productive as they were in the previous generation, and incomes are going up. Their wages are increasing in a way that's commensurate with their increasing productivity, right? So workers are, making more stuff at work, but they're being fairly compensated in terms of like higher incomes. That was the case for decades, roughly between 1948 and 1973. As it shows you here, the numbers between 1948 and 1979, productivity increased by 108.1%, and compensation increased by 95%. So again, like workers are twice as productive, but they're also making like twice the money that they did, maybe like their parents did. Then after about 1980, we see that these two numbers split, right? So that worker productivity continues to increase, like the amount of widgets or whatever it is that people are doing at work is still resulting in these productivity increases. But the amount of compensation that they receive begins to stagnate, and you see a growing gap between these two, between the dark line and the light blue line. And so then the question is like, well, if workers are making more stuff, if they're more productive, but they're not seeing like bigger wage increases or increases in their income, then who is benefiting? And so the answer, obviously, is their bosses. So, instead of the workers benefiting from their productivity increases, it's been the CEOs and upper management and stockholders and so on and so forth. They're the ones that have been benefiting from these increases in productivity as opposed to the workers themselves. That is a key difference between the period between the 40s and the 70s and the period since the 1970s. And a major explanatory factor for this, as we'll see in future lectures, I only have time to kind of introduce now, has to do with union power. In the period between the 40s and the 70s, the unions were much stronger. Workers were much more likely to be part of a union, to be represented by a union in those decades than they have been since. And the sort of the reason for that is, again, like a little too complicated for me to explain here because there are several things that happened all at once, but they have all kind of added up to a declining power of unions, and as a result, less power for workers to have their interests represented, um, less bargaining power among workers. And so as a result, it's really been the bosses who have profited from this continuing increase in productivity. So looks like we've reached the end of the slideshow. And these will be things that we'll continue to kind of come back to. I hope that this will help you, especially with like the film and, uh, as far as like what to get out of watching the film. And we'll set you up for future readings and assignments and quizzes and such. So until then, I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.